It's a pleasure to have you on the podcast today. How you doing?
I'm doing well. How are you? I love your
Good, good.
background.
Yeah. No, yeah, it's kind of improvised. So I thought, I'll do it in the garden today. Hopefully the weather's okay. Doesn't get dark anytime soon.
It looks nice. It looks nice and
Yeah.
peaceful.
Yeah, no, it is at the minute. My dogs aren't barking. But it's good to connect with you again and to do this. And I just kind of thought I'd introduce you because you help people like who are introverts, who are into like leadership, consulting, speaking. How did you kind of get into this, and kind of how do you kind of, build a business and what you do?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah, so just to kind of quickly introduce myself to those who are listening who may
Mm,
not know who I
mm,
am. So my name is Nancy John. I'm the founder and CEO of Seed Leadership. And the work that we do is focused around working with high performing introverted leaders who are looking to elevate their leadership. And in doing that, they want to be able to do that without feeling that they need to be more outgoing to do that. And so that's the focus that I have in my work. And the reason I came about focusing in that way was because there's a lot of misconceptions around introversion and leadership. Mainly the misconception is that the two don't mix somehow. Like you kind of have to have one, you can't have one with the other. And and so I obviously kind of being an introvert myself and recognizing some of the um, challenges with that, like that truly is a misconception. And so my work is around, okay, how, because having that sort of a mindset creates a lot of self-doubt. It creates a lot of questions around second guessing on what's one's capability could be. And it's actually problematic for anybody who holds the view as well. Because if you hold that view, you are actually quite limiting what's possible on your team. When we talk about diversity of approach and thought, all of that is really missed. So it really is kind of there. Like one of my main things around like, how do I help debunk this? Like what can my work do to help debunk that? And so that's kind of the focus there. So my work is really around elevating introverted leaders. It's not about fixing introversion. And I like to be very clear on that because a lot of times people assume that's because, oh, you're trying to help people not be introvert. I'm like, actually not. It's not about fixing introversion because there's nothing to fix. It's really about elevating what are the strengths that people have that they bring to the table, because we all have strengths and we all have things that we need to work on. So that's kind of where my focus goes in. And it's just as much about um, also supporting those who are not introverted but have leadership um, responsibilities, and their team consists of all kinds of people. So you have now the kind of like this understanding of how do I support a team without holding some of these biases. So it's kind of focused around in that space. But to be honest, even though that's kind of the where I go in terms of focusing on people, in the end, introversion is just the starting point. It's not the be all and end all. It is purely a starting point to the conversation. It's not kind of what encompasses the entire work that I do, but it certainly is the part that I start with so that people can see that there is a way to elevate what I have and who I am.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's awesome that you do that. And I think, like you said, with there's extroverts, isn't there, and they're introverts. And I think a lot of the time people probably put themselves in boxes or they get kind of probably put into boxes because of, say, being an introvert and probably allocating people who are introverts into certain roles when deep down they've got like, skills and processes which they can put into other areas. Do you know what I mean? And like,
Yes.
and we've all, and I think even in extroverts, I'm very extroverted, but I am quite introverted as well. And I think there's that kind of balance with some extroverts kind of are slightly introverted as well. But do like more people are more introverted, but
100%. 100%. Like none of us, the reality is none of us is like all and everything all the time. Like it is definitely the spectrum that we all ride. And I hear it's very interesting because I think it's important to recognize that that's why what I mean, like the introversion piece is just a starting point. It's not the be all and end all because we are so much more than any one of those things. But recognizing what you said, that we all ride the spectrum, what I have found for it's just, and I think it might be a little bit of a North American, or maybe not even North American, a Western society way of thinking, where we've elevated extroversion, like that ideal of an extroversion, as the be all and end all, and kind of delegated the other stuff to, oh, that I don't think that really fits in. And so you find a lot of times people having to justify their introversion. And I'm like, well, you actually don't need to, because there's actually really great qualities that everybody possesses. And my work is not about saying, well, now introverts are better than everybody else. That's not it at all. And it's not about bucketing anybody anywhere either. It's recognizing, just like whatever your help, where your thought process is around what you bring to the table, let's figure out a way to elevate what you do. It's just that usually in our Western society, just based on how we've operated, we've kind of said that these are the qualities that make for a great leader. And usually that has meant that your traditional introverted qualities somehow don't seem to make it in. Although if you popular, leadership conversations around listening, being present, um, the ability to kind of be reflective before responding to things, those are all very, very natural introverted qualities. But we'll
Yeah.
never actually associate it with that. Like, that's what I mean. Like, those qualities exist and they're valuable, but for some reason, the ideal of that charming, the person who can just like, who's a really good speaker, like that's what we kind of think is the leader. Whereas like it's not all of it. And there's so many qualities that introverted leaders bring to the table that I would love for people to recognize and see.
Yeah. No, it's really interesting, isn't it, when you think about it? Because, like I've worked with different people. Like when I used to work in hospitality and restaurants, you meet people who are very extroverted, and that's a very kind of extroverted role. And then you see introverts who
Yes.
might kind of not like that so much. But I know some introverts, like my brother, thinking about what we're talking about. He's very introverted, but he's very reflective. And like you said, there is that kind of part with introverts, very reflective, very kind of self-aware, if that makes sense. I think, and you can use
Yes.
those kind of
Yes.
qualities in certain areas of work. But like, what would you say, like the kind of the first kind of steps that you kind of work with people who are, say, introverted and they kind of want to venture into a certain role, if that makes sense?
Yeah. So, I mean, the first things that we do, and I feel that this is something for all of us, whether whatever you're doing in life, is getting really clear on what you bring to the table. So one of the first things is really around the discovery process, like self-awareness around what is your mode of operating when it comes to, for example, communicating, when it comes to dealing with change, kind of like how do you operate, that self-awareness component. And we look at it purely from like what's the strength as well as what's the limitation. And I feel like that's not something that's just helpful for an introverted. It's sort of helpful for anybody who's extroverted, if you're anywhere in between, it's helpful for anybody. So that's a starting point. So you can kind of say, okay, here's what you bring to the table. What is it? Where are you looking to go from here? It's almost like, where do we start? Like, this is point A. Where do we want to go? Point B. But we just have to have both of those things in place. And then we can talk about, great, to actually get there, what's needed. And so I have some specific areas that I focus in on with the work that I do. I'm not necessarily saying these are the only things that are important, but the focus around communicating more persuasively, the focus on building stronger ability to build really good partnerships with people, and as well as the ability to be able to deliver tough messages, like, whether that's tough feedback or whatever, like, a tough message. Those are three key things. And uh, I feel broadly most leaders see that as valuable skills to build. Certainly I found most of the clients that I work with, like, that's why they work with me. Those are three key areas. So then we'll focus in on that. But we always start with, what are you bringing to the table? Because there's nothing you can do. And a lot of times we start with, well, what are the gaps that I have? It's like, no, absolutely, we'll look at the gaps, but what do you already bring to the table? So then we can decide how much of that is a gap, how much of that is something you need to do, how much of that is something you need to outsource someone else to do. Because it's not just about, what do I need to do differently? And I find that's what happens is like all of a sudden there's a level of ownership that increases, and it's not necessarily just about how can I become a completely different person. It's recognizing what do I bring to the table and what would I need to sharpen? Because we all have things to sharpen. Like nobody is completely, oh, I have it all down pat. It's just not it's just not the reality, right? So I think recognizing it that way and not recognizing that your introversion in and of itself has nothing to do with that.
I really
That's
like that,
kind of
and
the starting point.
yeah, I really like that, and I think like most times, like probably we kind of think that like, oh, where is it I need to improve, and I think we don't always think, oh, what am I, like I said, bringing to the table, what have you already got, and then kind of
Yes.
going from there, and then kind of sharpening on what you've already got, and that's such a
Yeah.
nicer approach, if that makes sense as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
And like with introverts, like because when most people think introverts, they must think, oh, it's people who don't aren't as good in social situations. Like, would you say it's just more than that, if that makes sense? It's more than just people who are introverts may do quite well in those situations. Is that where people kind of struggle?
Yeah. I mean, it's a good question, Adam, because my question back would really be what when you say don't do well in social situations, like what do we mean? What do we mean don't do well in social
Yeah,
situations?
I I think if someone, like, when I first thought of introverts, like when I wasn't aware of it, I was thinking, oh, introvert
Yeah.
people, because I've worked with introvert people where I work from what I've seen in my experience in restaurants, where people might not be too confident in engaging with someone. Say
Got
if
it.
they're at a table and they're serving them, but like, would you say like, some introverted people are fine in those situations and they don't
Right.
need help? Do you know what I mean? In other areas,
Right. Right. 100%. I think uh, it's a human quality, right? So I would
yeah,
say 100% there's introverts who are completely fine. They're completely fine. So what I like to distinguish for people is distinguishing between shyness and introversion. They're not actually the same thing. And this book that a book like it's quite popular, like kind of really talking about introversion, is called Quiet. It's by Susan Cain, and I really like the way she defines it. And I'm going to be completely paraphrasing it because I don't remember it verbatim. But she talks about that distinction between shyness and introversion because introversion, shyness is this kind of uh, discomfort with, or inability to want to step out, inability
mm,
to want to, like, it's almost like a um second guessing of self.
yeah,
It's almost like a insecurity around it, whereas
yeah,
introversion is not. Introversion is simply, introverts have a very deep internal life. For introverts, their energy like comes from doing small group or solitude activities. That doesn't mean an introvert always wants to be in solitude and always wants to do that. That's not it. I think sometimes people think we sometimes go way too polar, like it's like all or nothing. That's not what it is. I'll give a good example. So, uh, in my career, a lot of times I've had to do like either really large presentations, or actually presentation is not a good idea. Good explanation. I think really large training events.
mm,
So large training events over the course of, let's say, a week, right? Full days, entire week, large groups, you're always on, always on. You have to be like, okay, so what's next? You got to be on top of what the content is. You also have to be on top of what the questions are going to be coming, kind of just engaging with people, paying very close attention to, okay, you know what, I'm noticing that this is what's connecting with Adam, but then on this side, I have this person that's not connecting with them. So all of that's happening. And in all of that's being, that's something kind of like an engagement that's happening. And so in the process of that, what's happening for an introvert is that the energy is going from here outward. Like it's kind of like I'm fueling into that energy. And so what happens at an end of a week like that is I'm exhausted And the idea of going out,
Mm.
like with a large group of people or going out to the bar or something, it's just not as enticing for me because I'm like, I just need a moment
Yeah.
to like recoup the energy. Whereas for most extroverts, it's the opposite. Most extroverts are, they're the other way around. They're like sucking in the energy
Yeah.
when they're with the people. They're like taking it in, taking it in. And at the end of the day, when their day's done, they're depleting of energy when they're on their own. Like I'm very simplifying it, but I'm just kind of just saying like it's an energy exchange that's happening. So recognizing that it's a energy question for introverts. It's not a I don't like people thing because that's not what it is. I think people
Yeah.
just assume that's what's happening,
Yeah.
and it's not. It's an energy piece that's important to recognize. Are there introverts who are have some may not be confident with like maybe building certain relationships or may not be confident with, let's say presenting on some things, but there's also extroverts, I would say, who are the same.
Yeah,
they're
definitely.
they're they have also, I'm not comfortable with things, my delivery is not the best, I want to get better at that. So I think that's just distinguishing what's energy versus what's shyness, recognizing somebody being quiet because they're observing, they're taking something in, versus somebody who's quiet because they're uncomfortable, they don't know. Those are two different things. The uncomfortable I don't know can be anybody, and the observation and stuff can also be anybody. Generally you find introverts being much more like, I'm observing, I'm going to observe first. And what happens is we just assume a quiet just means the same thing. We assume that quiet means, oh, I don't think that person is comfortable, and I'm like, that's not actually true. So I do work, when I work with my clients, I do talk about how can we help better educate people so they understand what your quiet means sometimes. But the work is also with the leaders and the folks who are not introverted to also understand. It's back and forth, right? So the idea of it's possible that introverts are more uncomfortable in social situations. Well, if you look at extremes, like, and let's just look at extreme. A very extreme introvert, and the vast majority of all of us are, we ride the spectrum, but there are some of us who are in the extreme sides. A very extreme introvert, yeah, probably they're like, I don't really want to be in a lot of social interactions, so maybe that makes it look like they are not great with social situations. But I would say a very extreme extrovert would be the same way. A very extreme extrovert would be the person who just does all the talking, does zero listening. They have no awareness that that's what they're doing. Does that make them better in a social situation? They're just not aware of it, but everyone else around them is like, oh gosh, what the hell's going on right now, right? So I think it's just recognizing that we have just kind of bucketed some of these things based on, again, I feel like there's just certain norms that have been just become part of our culture, especially Western wise. I don't want to say it's everywhere. I can only really speak from a Western perspective. It's become very normal for us to think that way, that one over the other.
Yeah. No, I think they're really, really good points. And I think it's definitely that energy exchange, isn't there? And I think it's quite fascinating when you think about human behavior and that there's more going on than what we just see. And people kind of like interpret that what they just see. And then there's all this energy exchange, and then they might, and there might be an introvert, there might be more extrovert, and people don't always see that. They don't kind of go beyond that lens, if that makes sense. And
Yes.
it's it's really interesting when you think about like, how energy works, and like when you do say those seminars, then you feel burnt out, and then you have to recharge. And I kind of find that as well. Like, if you're on the go all the time, you need a bit of time to recharge. And some people might be able to do that and go out, or whatever. But
Yes.
it's really interesting when you think about it. So if you're like running a business and you're wanting to get the best out of people, like I said, it's so important to be able to understand, you know, how people work and their personality, to make it more efficient, rather than people just
Yes.
judging, oh, they're this way, X, Y, Z.
Yes. And the thing is, if I would say it's important for each of us to recognize our own patterns. Because if you can recognize your own pattern, then you know how to work with it. And then you can decide, Do I want to continue working with this? Do I want to tweak something here? But recognize your pattern, and some of it's accepting a pattern. Like there's certain things that we are wired towards, and okay, great. So that's kind of my wiring. Do I want to change it? Maybe, or maybe I don't want to change it. But that recognition is really important to kind of figure out, okay, what, right?
Mm.
We, like I said, for me in my work, especially the whole idea of working with introverts, that is only a starting point. It is
Yeah,
simply
of
a
course.
starting point to the conversation. I do not, like my work, I do not spend the rest of the time being like, well, how can we become, different kinds of introverts? It's not. It's like once you recognize,
Yeah.
okay, this is my pattern, this is how I operate, it's simply a starting point. After that, it's more about, great, so where do you want to go? And what
Mm.
parts of your patterns are supportive of that?
Yeah.
What parts of your patterns are getting in your way? Is it something
Mm.
you want to do something about? Okay, great, then we can do. But if you can, like, Adam, I'm not sure, I kind of want want to do something about it, but I'm not going to
Mm.
really do something about it, that's okay too. But the awareness and recognizing there's a, like, kind of just respecting that piece is important. And I feel like we all can do that for each other. And like I said, all of us bring a lot of value to the table, and that's why I'm a big proponent of like collaborative teams. It's not about who. Nobody would want an entire team that's all one way, whether that's from an introversion perspective, whether that's from a experience perspective, whether that's from like all of us are from the same industry. Again, depending on the team, right? Like, do we want that? The same goes the same. Do we want everybody to be completely extroverted? Everybody's going to have the same. That's not a great integrating collaborative team. We all know that. Yet we're all driven to similarity. It's just how we operate. Like we are driven to that. So the conscious effort is to say, okay, I see this, but I value this in me. And then that will allow me to value what's in you as well. Because if I can't actually value what I bring to the table, I'm for sure going to project that onto you and not value your approach to something, and kind of just take what I'm feeling and push it out that way. But if I can really value my approach, I can then be like, oh, you know what, Adam? I never saw it that way. Okay. Yeah. You know what? I don't know that I agree with it, but I'm willing to
Mm.
take a moment to take a step back. So I feel, but yeah, if we don't take time, so I think that's why that starting of that awareness piece, kind of that accepting and recognizing, okay, I acknowledge my pattern. That's how else can we start, right? So I think that for me, that's a big part of the work that I do. But again, starting point. It's
Yeah.
not the end.
It's quite powerful, isn't it, when you think about it, and how important it is as well with all of this. And I suppose when you have clients, for them to be accountable and to like, take ownership
Mm,
of kind of what is going on and be like, okay, I see this, I get this, I'm willing to work on X, Y, Z. Because it's like if they're not accountable, then there's not going to
yes.
be any movement. And like, do you think like in the Western world or in other parts of business that more businesses are being more kind of understanding or open about this with introverts and
But
extroverts and looking more
oh,
into it, with their
yeah,
work colleagues?
yeah, it's a good question. I don't know. I don't want to speak out of turn because I can't.
No,
I don't know that I
yeah,
can say definitively, but I mean, I
in
do
some
believe
sectors.
yeah, I would say maybe even like when we're looking at introversion, extroversion, like we're getting quite specific here. So I do believe that there's organizations that are, if I think more broadly around um, diversity of thought, diversity of ideas, maybe, and diversity and inclusion in general. I do believe like there are organizations working towards that. There's work to be done. It's not, I think it's just like recognizing it's just not just going to happen right away.
Yeah,
But I do believe there's organizations that are being intentional. I believe there's uh, maybe even think rather than thinking about it from like an organization level, I do believe
yeah,
there's leaders who are kind of thinking about, oh, how can I be more aware of kind of creating more collaboration between teams. So I do believe that's happening,
mm,
and I also believe that it's, I think we have to recognize it's not happening perfectly,
yeah,
um, and what does that mean for us? So like, what does that mean in terms of, if it's not happening perfectly, what could progress look like in that space.
Mm.
And I feel that we all can be part of that process and kind of creating progress and being active about, okay, well, how do I recognize, again, I think it starts with how do I recognize the pattern that I follow? Because then I will be better able to appreciate and
Yeah,
recognize it in other people and encourage them too to be like, what is the pattern you follow? But
yeah,
I do think there's leaders. I mean, I can certainly say of the clients that I'm working with, based on the work that they do, I'm confident that they take that mindset onwards into what they will build. And so, yeah, in that way, I can say, yes, it's happening,
yeah,
and I believe that other folks who are doing similar work and kind of building, what I don't mean just, and this is where I'm kind of
yeah.
getting stepping beyond introversion, extroversion, but those of us who are doing work around building more collaborative leaders, building
Mm.
more stronger leaders. I'm
Yeah,
going to believe that that's in pockets that work is happening, and then larger scale organizations doing that work. So yeah, it's happening in bits in smaller spaces. Um,
yeah,
I'm not sure that I could say right now that, oh yeah, I can see this. I
yeah.
can speak to like this
Overall,
big sea change that's happening, but I
yeah.
certainly know actively that for that there's organizations that are working towards
Mm.
collaboration, greater diversity, greater inclusion.
Yeah, definitely. And I think you get more out of somebody and they're happy in what they're doing if they're being understood, and that's welcomed, isn't it? And I think
Yes,
it must be rewarding in what you do and seeing people grow and shift it in their lives and stuff.
it's amazing. Yeah, it's one of my favorite things is for there to be like aha moments, like when it clicks, something clicks, and it's not so much because of something I said, but because as that person was thinking through and speaking through what they were saying, they're like, oh, I get it. Okay, I have my answer now. Like it's just really amazing because you kind of recognize, um, yeah, like you do have the answer. What you're just feeling a bit clouded around it at this point. So that's amazing. Amazing to see progress that uh, folks can make in a very short amount of time with some very small intentional activity. What progress can be made? It's actually really awesome, and so that. I love that. I love being part of that work with people.
I love that, and I think that it's so important, isn't it? To do something that you really enjoy and you can provide value and help other people.
Yes,
It's really
yes,
like nourishing, and you
yes.
know, and there's lots of successful people out there who are very introverted people. A lot of famous people are very introverted. Um, I mean, I read Steve Jobs' autobiography when he was around, and he was a very very introvert person. And when he was, I
Yeah.
can't remember where he was working somewhere. I think it was at Packard Bell or Intel, and they made him like go in the night shift because he didn't want to be around people, and he was a bit of a peculiar guy, so he just did the night shift, and there was no one around him. But yeah,
Yeah.
there's lots of skills, isn't there? There's lots of skills and qualities that we all have, and like you said at the start, it's bringing your goodness to the table and just kind of seeing where it needs to be sharpened.
Yes, exactly. And I feel what happens is sometimes, when you hear stories about someone like a Steve Jobs, uh, I can't really, like, I can't speak to for sure, I know this for sure, but I feel like maybe he might have been a bit more on the extreme side of introversion. That's not really where most people ride. So I think what happens, people
Yeah,
think, oh, because he was like that, then that means, most introverts don't want to hang out with people and don't want, that's actually not, there's, a
yeah,
lot of like, I have this concept that I've coined, which is called the relational introvert.
mm,
And I had a podcast that was focused on that, just kind of talking about what it is to be relational and an introvert, because the two actually marry well together. It's
mm,
just what it means to be in relationship just looks different. That doesn't mean no to relationship. It just means it looks different. And I feel that there's an opportunity for people to realize, just because someone, you know, distinguishing between social and being relational. I think that's the most important thing.
mm,
Those are not the two of the same things.
yeah,
Social is, can associate with like, oh, like going out and, all that kind of stuff. Whereas relational is being in relationship with people. And those are two different things. And I feel sometimes we just have kind of put the two together and said, well, that means like introverts are, I'm like, no, actually introverts
Yeah.
may get into very deep, most, I don't want to say generalized,
Yeah.
but like in, you know, most of them prefer deeper conversations, smaller groups, which means we can get into deeper relationships. Also, there's a lot of introverts who enjoy going out, and like it's so like it's just recognizing it's not a
Yeah.
all or nothing. There's a spectrum we ride. There's just these misconceptions around leadership and introversion, and that's kind of where I like to focus in and to be able to
Yeah.
say, look, let's recognize what the misconception is, and how we work with that, because there's a big miss if we don't do that. In his book, Good to Great, Jim Collins actually, when he talks about level 5 leadership, one of the things he acknowledges about level 5 leaders is he talks about their ability to be that they don't. I can't remember the exact words he used, but he was kind of
Yeah.
like kind of associating with like humility. But I don't know if that's the word that he used. But he talks about the idea of leaders who don't need to be in the limelight. He talks about level 5 leaders being that sort of a leader. And I'm like, that actually is, I mean, think about that, you know? So when I think about that as a component of a level 5 leader, I'm like, oh my gosh, like as introverted leaders, there's like a natural quality that fits in to being a good leader. There's also qualities that have to be sharpened. So, but that goes for someone who's more extroverted as well. That goes for someone who's somewhere in the middle. That goes for someone who's 75%. It actually goes for everybody. So that's where I'm just like, you know, there's misconceptions that I think might paint people in a certain way, which I feel are just beliefs that we've carried, because it seems that's just how it's just been something that's been reinforced for us. I think there's an
Yeah.
opportunity for us to think differently about it.
Definitely. I think it's important, isn't it? You to see that kind of overall kind of perspective on all of it. I think it's not
Yeah.
just box A, box B kind of thing, which most people
Yeah.
probably do, you know. And
Yes.
I think like as well, like, you know, like introverts and extroverts, and being an introvert, like there's that kind of synergy, I suppose, as well in either personal relationships or in business.
Yes.
You know, like if you're in a relationship with someone, like in your partner's very extroverted, you know you're more introverted, you can kind of probably process things differently and see things in a different way and go, hold on a sec.
Yes. 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 Yeah, and that's why it's not surprising that a lot of times that those opposites attract. So my husband is more extroverted than I am. I'm a little bit more introverted. And again, neither of us is extreme on either end. But that's why I tell people most of us are kind of, we ride that spectrum somewhere along there. But he is more extroverted, I'm more introverted. And I mean, that idea of like opposites attracting, like there's a connection, there's a way that we operate together that works out really well. And I feel that happens more often than not. It probably happens in our friendships as well, right? Like there's people that we kind of just are drawn to, because what ultimately brings us together is our values. If our values aren't in line, then we clash. But if we have values in line and then we kind of have a different way of operating, we can still work together. Like we can, you know, we can still kind of have a connection, we can build rapport and things like that. But it's when like some of our held values, whatever they are, you know, it's hard to tell right away, but whatever those held values are, you know right away whether there's a click or not. And that's when you know there's something happening here that I don't know what that is. And that's when you know that I don't know that that'll work. And it's not always because someone's, I mean, think about it. You talked about your brother. Okay, sibling relationships are a little bit different because there's always like a
Yeah.
little bit of conflict in sibling relationships.
Yeah.
But there's a connection, right? But there's also this connection that even if you think about some of your friends who may be different than you, but you have a connection with them for some reason. It's because you guys have something deeper that connects you than how you do. You don't maybe just approach everything the same way, but
Yeah.
something connects you.
Yeah, it's interesting. I find it fascinating. I find people fascinating, and you know,
Yes.
introverts, and yeah, I mean, like I said, we're all kind of in a, what's the word, like a work in progress in some sense. I mean, we've all got things we constantly working on and learning, and I think that's like one of
Yes.
the kind of nice kind of parts of life. We're kind of always evolving and learning, and I was
Yeah.
just thinking as well, like, um, Do you have any favorite books or anything like that at all, or any kind of role models?
Uh, so books, yes, I have like three. I mean, I, three that come top of mind right now, just
Yeah.
probably because of recency as well. Like in the last couple of years, there's tons of other books I'm sure I could have listed off, but the three that came top of mind when you had initially asked me that question was Quiet, which I think I mentioned earlier in the call today. Quiet by Susan Cain. There's Radical Candor by Kim Scott, and there's Universal Christ by Richard Rohr. And so the three books for me have been quite instrumental from a development piece from at different layers. So from a personal, professional, and spiritual. So kind of each of them has really propelled my growth, shifted my perspective, made me think differently and go like, oh, there's another way. So kind of like an expansion for me from a personal, professional, and spiritual perspective, which is always great because that's made me now do differently, act differently, be different, approach things differently. So yeah, those would be the three that I would say stand out for me.
I love that, and I like how you kind of how they've kind of helped you in that way as well. Like, and that's kind of like the amazing thing with books. If people resonate with certain books, they can really, and especially if it's like three that kind of go hand in hand as well.
Yes, yes.
That's awesome. No, I've never had someone kind of explain like that. I love that. That's awesome. And I was just thinking, like, do you have any role models or mentors growing up on now?
uh, yeah, I thought about that, and I would say yes. Um, and it's a bit like seasonal for me, for lack of a better word, like based on the stages in my life. I've had different
Yeah,
people, I would say, that have resonated. So for example, having uh yeah, like I remember one of these leaders I used to work with in a previous role. She just has an ability, she had an ability to prioritize the person over the role. And so I really resonated with that, and then it really drew me to be like, okay, what are how are some of the ways that she's approaching? I remember in high school having one of my teachers who like really challenged me, like in the way, especially he was an English teacher, and he challenged the way that I wrote, and he actually like he challenged me to the degree that he completely changed, like he in a good way changed my writing. And so I definitely appreciated that, even though I fought him many times. I was just like, no, I don't agree with that. But at the same time, like he really elevated me to be that way. So I find that depending on stages in my life, I've had people come in. I'm grateful for that. But then the static in my life, like, definitely my mom is somebody that I admire. She really demonstrates the gift of hospitality in a way that I haven't really seen someone else, like in a very generous way. She's like, that's her gift. She goes, whatever she does, that's her gift. And so she exercises that gift very well. My husband is somebody who really stands out to me. He's someone who's just, no matter whoever meets him, he has a way that people connect with him. Like he just has a way to connect with people, which I think is amazing, right? So people just like, yeah, like people have an admiration and love for him, which is great. Like,
mm.
I that's something to be able to see and learn from, like with people that are near to me. So yeah, I just find like for me, it's usually aside from like those kind of standard static people in my life, like ongoing people. Oh, I have another really good friend. He's what I really admire about him is his ability to he like from a spiritual perspective, he had some major personal growth many, many years ago, well before any of us were ready for it. But he never held any judgment for anyone who did not see it his way. His ability to be curious and his ability to have a space to have a conversation is amazing, because now when I'm going through some of my big shifts in some very significant areas, like in a spiritual sense and everything, I can go to him and know there's no judgment. So I think that's another great, kind of to be able to learn from that. And what I like is all of these people are different ages. You know, my friend is younger than me, my husband is older than me, my mother is much older than me. So they're like all in different stages. So you can have anyone at any stage in your life to do that. Um, but I feel like what happens is usually I'm going through some personal development in my own life, and I'm then attracted to people who emulate that. And then I kind of look at that and say, well, you know what? I love how they're emulating that. And so for me, I find usually I'm drawn to people who can accomplish courage and kindness at the same time. And so I find that I'm drawn to that.
Yeah, no, I love that. I think it's so important to have, role models and mentors and, people to look up to. And I think, it's really nice, you have your husband, your mom and your close friend, as well. I really like that. And it's not always people who are on TV or celebrities, sometimes it's the people who are like, closest to us, isn't it, really?
Yes.
Um, and, there's no kind of age, what's the word, you can't really put a number on the age, can you? Really, doesn't matter what age someone is. You can look up to someone who's maybe 17 or 18 years old. Doesn't matter.
Yeah.
And I'm just thinking, like, is there any kind of projects that you kind of want to talk about that are ongoing, or where can people find you on, like, website, social media, that kind of thing?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so I'll give,
Welcome.
folks are welcome to reach out to me. I think I've shared a little bit about my work and what I do. If you want to really learn about me, One Space is my website. You can just go on to www.seedleadershipdevelopment.com. So that's one place that you can learn about the work and everything. And another place actually where you can get a lot of information about me is just on LinkedIn. I'm quite active on LinkedIn. So if anybody wants to look me up, what I do, what I'm focused on, just, Nancy John. I don't think there's a lot of Nancy Johns in there, but if there are, just look for my picture because I do have a picture on there. But yeah, you can find, that's another great way just to look up what I do, and what I'm focused on right now. So yeah, I'd encourage people to do that.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. And like, I just really, really love, like, what you're doing, kind of what you're about in our life, and helping other people, grow in what they're doing. And I think it's really, really positive. And I just want to say, I want to wish you all the best in everything that you're doing as well.
Thanks, Adam, and thank you for having me on today. It was nice to have a chat with you.
No, you're welcome. You're welcome. And I wish you all the best and take care.
Thank you. Thank you.
Cheers.